Here's the task. You should spend about 20 minutes on this task, of course. The chart shows the percentage of male and female teachers in 6 different types of educational setting in the UK, United Kingdom in 2010. Summarise the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant, and of course write at least 150 words. Here's the graph. Okay, so let's have a look at the axes. Along the horizontal axis, the x-axis, you've got nursery, preschool, primary school, secondary school, college, private training institutes, don't really know what this is, to be honest, and university. In the United Kingdom, primary school is 5 to 11-year-olds, kind of roughly equivalent to elementary school. Secondary school is kind of 11 to 16. College is usually 16 to 18, but you don't actually need to know that for this particular essay. What you need to know is about the men and women, the gender distribution, and in the y-axis, the vertical axis, you've got the percentage for the percentage of men and the percentage of women at each of these 6 different educational settings, educational institutions. And what's immediately clear, so the men are the blue, the women are the red, what's immediately clear to me is you've got nursery, preschool and primary school. Women are overwhelmingly in the majority. The word overwhelmingly probably isn't strong enough. It's almost entirely female dominated, whereas later on the gender balance is more even. There are almost as many men and women at secondary school, college and at private training institutes. However, when you get to university level, men are significantly in the majority by a ratio of about 2 to 1, just over 2 to 1. So men are significantly higher represented in the teaching profession, significantly more than women. As amongst university lecturers, we can talk about lecturers there. What I've just been doing, by the way, I've just been thinking through this graph, trying to use as much language as I possibly can. So how can you structure the essay here? Well, there's 2 ways you could structure the essay. You could either talk about men, and then in a separate paragraph you can talk about women, but I'm going to do it in a slightly different way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about, first of all, nursery and primary school, and then I'm going to talk about secondary school, college and private training institutes, and then I'm going to finish with universities. So let's think about that. I'll look at the structure in a moment again. Before I even write, let's think about some vocabulary. Now, there are some words that appear in the task question. So the word teacher, talks about male and female teachers. What synonyms or near synonyms can you think of for the word teacher? Here's a few of them you could think of. Teaching post, teaching position, teaching staff. So you don't have to talk about teacher all the time. You could talk about teaching staff, male and female teaching staff. You could talk about educators. That's more of an American English term, educator. Lecturer, and that's certainly useful when you're talking about college and universities. If you're talking about the private training institute, over here, you could talk about a trainer, of course. Now at the bottom of the graph you've got the 6 different educational settings. You don't really want to be talking about educational setting all the time either, so here are some synonyms for that. You could talk about educational institutions or teaching institutions. You could of course simply talk about schools. You could even talk about institutions which cater for children, or which cater for older students, for young people. And that gives you, this phrase gives you a relative clause, which cater for, which the IELTS examiner will love. Men and women, of course you could talk about male and female teachers, male and female educators. You could talk about gender. Percentage. Now, the graph is a percentage graph. We're not talking about the numbers of men or the numbers of women. We're talking about the percentage of men and the percentage of women. So don't talk about the number of female teachers. You've got to talk about the percentages. You could also, the synonyms for percentage, you could use the word proportion or share. So this is some vocabulary that we can use when we do our writing. What we've also got to do, it's a bar chart. So in keeping with most bar chart questions, it's a comparison task. So we need to have lots of language for comparison. For example, the chart compares. Also, you could talk about smaller proportions or larger proportions or larger shares. So men formed a smaller proportion of teachers in secondary school. As many as, the phrase as many as is really useful when you're comparing things. You can talk about twice as many as, so there are twice as many male lecturers at university as female lecturers. 10 times as many. I think actually at preschool nurseries, maybe between 9 and 10 times as many women as men. Predominated, so women predominate in the primary school and nursery school level. Form the majority, the minority. So a collocation here with majority and minority is form. You form the majority. Men formed the majority of teachers in university and in private training institutes. More equally represented or equally represented. So in college, men and women are equally represented. In secondary school, the two genders are more equally represented, but not exactly the same. Significantly higher or lower. So men are significantly lower than women in primary schools. And outnumbered. The word outnumbered is very useful. You can also collocate outnumbered with words like vastly. Vastly outnumbered. Men are vastly outnumbered in nursery. But men are slightly outnumbered in secondary schools. So that's some good language for comparison. You've also got to make approximations when you're talking about numbers. So you could say approximately, roughly, or about. So let's write the report now. First thing we must do is think about the structure of the report. Obviously first you're going to start off with an introduction, and then what I normally do is second paragraph I talk about the overall picture. I give an overview of the graph. There are two ways I can think of structuring this. You could either talk about, for example, women first and then men, or you could do men first and then women. And if you were doing a paragraph about women, you could talk about how they vastly outnumbered the men, how they were significantly in the majority in the younger age groups. You could then talk about how women were about half of the teaching profession at secondary school, exactly half at college. They were slightly in the minority in the private training institutes, and they form quite a significant minority at university. Maybe not a significant minority, but certainly a small minority, about a third of the teaching profession at university level. And then you could talk about the men afterwards. I'm not going to do that. what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to basically break the bar charts into 3 different chunks. I'm going to talk about the nursery and primary school settings first, and then I'm going to talk about the secondary and college and the private training institutes, and then I'm going to talk about, as a short final paragraph, I'm going to talk about the universities, because I think the gender balance in these 3 chunks is significantly different to each other, so it makes for a more interesting essay. So let's start off with the introduction. So obviously it's a bar chart. You must always remember, of course, to paraphrase and try and use some of this language that we came up with at the top. So what does the bar chart do? It gives information, shows information. You could even use the word compares. The bar chart compares. In fact, let's do that. The bar chart compares the proportion of male and female. So this time I'm not using men and women as in the task question, but male and female. I'll stick with teachers. You don't need to paraphrase everything. I could say in 6 different types of educational setting, but you need to paraphrase in a range of educational institutions in the UK in 2010. And there we've paraphrased. That's done. Introduction's done. So what's the overall picture of the graph then? Well, the overall picture really is massive kind of gender imbalance with women predominant at the younger age groups and men more dominant at the older age groups, and with this kind of balance in between. So you don't need to go into detail with this, but you could say something like overall there are significant differences between the genders, but we could talk about in employment patterns between men and women. There are significant differences in employment patterns between men and women across, we talk about across a sector, across the education sector. So there are significant differences in employment patterns between men and women across the education sector. I'm just going to make the language a little bit stronger though. Instead of saying there are and then doing that, I'm going to say significant differences in employment patterns between men and women across the education sector are apparent. That's a better piece of language to use than simply saying there are or there is something. Note that what I'm doing here, what tenses this compares are, here I'm using the present simple because I'm talking about the graph. But what I'm going to do when I start talking about the details, I'm going to start using the past tense because I'm talking about the situation in 2010 when I'm talking about the numbers. So let's now write a paragraph about nursery and primary. I'm going to start off with a topic sentence. I'm going to put my key information in the first sentence of this paragraph. So I could say something like women predominated in schools for children. I could say up to the age of 11 as well, if you know that information, of course. That's the key information. That's your topic sentence. Okay, let's give it some supporting information. This was, let's think about nursery. This was especially true This is especially not in schools. It's talking about teaching institutions for very young children, under the age of 5 in fact. Let's put some data in. I need some data now to support this last sentence. So I could say over how much is it in the graph? I think it's over 95 or about 95% of nursery school teachers, for instance, because I'm giving an example here, for instance, were female, were women. And then let's just again support that information. So there was a similar situation in primary schools. Let's put a bit of data there where, how many again? It's over 90% here, over 90%. So that's good. I did about here, over here, different language, where over 90% of teachers, let's see it, teachers were women. Because I've used the word female here, so I don't want to repeat myself too much. Okay, that's done. Let's go on to secondary and college. So here it's more even. So the topic sentence, what's the key thing I'm going to say? I could say something like there was more of a gender balance. That's quite a good bit of language there. So secondary school, college, this used one of those phrases I used further up, teaching institutions. In teaching institutions, let's go back up to the language. What did I say? Institutions which cater for, okay, let's use that. Which catered for older students. Students. I've used students rather than children here. That's good. For older children, private training in college, you could say, and young adults, I guess, up to the age of, maybe that in the private training institution they're more up to 21, not quite sure. So older students and young adults. And now let's put a bit of extra information in there, some data. For example, in the college, let's talk about, in fact, college lecturers. For example, college lecturers it's 50-50. So we could say equally divided between male and female teachers, or in fact better to say between men and women, equally divided. That's enough. And then let's look at university just to finish off. So what can we say about universities? Men in the majority by quite a big margin. So you could say male lecturers were significantly, let's do significantly, in the majority in universities. Where now they accounted for, I think, 70%, where 70% of teaching staff were male. And let's put a little bit of extra information. Let's do a semicolon. This was more than twice as many. In fact, let's just say more than twice the number of female lecturers. And I think that's done. So what language have we used? We talked about all these things. We haven't used the word. We've used lecturer, didn't need trainer. Get rid of that. Educational setting. Use most of those. We talked about gender. I talked about proportion, I think, a little bit. This chart compares, forms the majority. We've used some of this language, not all of it. I just want to see how many words I've done. Hopefully it's 150. Let's have a look. And we've got 140 words. Okay. So we're on 140 words. We can just write one quick sentence to make sure we're above the 150 word limit, just to sum up the whole graph. So you could say something like women. Probably a good start to say overall. Just you've got a nice signposting word there. Overall, women were more likely to be found in educational settings where there were young children whereas, and again IELTS examiners love that kind of word, whereas male teachers, what could we say? Well, that they're in the university, maybe a more prestigious, higher status kind of job, perhaps. So you could say male teachers predominated in the higher status teaching position, teaching role, higher status teaching role of a university lecturer. And then we're done, finished. So we're now 170 words, way over where we needed to be. Okay, so there's our task 1 report. Let's just read through that so we can check for any mistakes, any silly little grammar mistakes that can creep in and lose you marks. The bar chart compares the proportion of male and female teachers in a range of educational institutions in the UK in 2010. Overall, significant differences in employment patterns between men and women across the education sector are apparent. Women predominated in schools for children up to the age of 11. This was especially true in teaching institutions for very young children. About 95% of nursery school teachers, for instance, were female. There was a similar situation in primary schools where over 90% of teachers were women. So we've used the past tense there. There was more of a gender balance in teaching institutions which catered for, probably don't need the comma there, which catered for older students and young adults. For example, college lecturers were equally divided between men and women. Male lecturers were significantly in the majority in universities, where 70% of teaching staff were male. This was more than twice the number of female lecturers. Overall, women were more likely to be found in educational settings where there were young children, whereas male teachers... I'm going overboard with the commas, I think, here. Whereas male teachers predominated in the higher status teaching role of a university lecturer. And we're done. Note, by the way, I've not really mentioned that much data. I've mentioned data here, here. I've alluded to the data here were equally divided, 70%. So only about 4 times that I've actually mentioned any particular data, whereas I could have done a lot more. There's actually 12 different data points here. But when you're writing the Task 1 report, you don't need to put in all the data. Just use the data to support your key points. Don't bloat your report with too much numerical information. So there we are. There's our Task 1 report.